April 12, 1945. The ancient cobblestone streets of Bernheim, a small village in the rolling hills of western Germany, glistened under the morning drizzle. Private First Class Thomas Harrington of the United States Marine Corps shivered as the damp spring air penetrated his threadbare uniform, his eyes scanning the nearly abandoned marketplace where just months ago, local farmers had sold their produce under a very different flag. He believed his unit would pass through quickly, another forgettable village on their eastward advance in the final days of the conflict, but Bernheim would soon become the setting for an encounter that would alter the course of his life forever. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how one underprivileged American serviceman's act of basic human kindness toward two German sisters during the chaotic final days of the Second World War would lead to an extraordinary meeting with their father, and a decision that would challenge everything both sides thought they knew about their supposed enemies. The Western Front was collapsing rapidly by April 1945. The once mighty German war machine that had conquered most of Europe was now in full retreat, with American, British, and French forces pushing relentlessly eastward. Supply lines were stretched thin on both sides, and civilians caught in between faced desperate circumstances as food reserves dwindled to almost nothing. Thomas Harrington had not volunteered for this war. At 20 years old, he had been working at his father's struggling repair shop in rural Pennsylvania when his draft notice arrived. His family had lost nearly everything in the Great Depression, and Thomas had been forced to abandon his education after 8th grade to help support his 5 younger siblings. Despite his limited formal schooling, Thomas possessed a natural mechanical aptitude and an even stronger sense of right and wrong. Marines, secure the village perimeter, established checkpoints at all major roads, ordered Lieutenant James Woodward, a career military officer from a wealthy Boston family who rarely concealed his disdain for the draftees under his command. Harrington, Wilson, check those buildings on the eastern edge. Intelligence reports possible supply caches. Yes, sir, Thomas responded, adjusting the strap of his rifle as he and Corporal Wilson headed toward a cluster of stone buildings at the village edge. Though officially assigned to the Marines, Thomas served as a mechanic in a mixed unit that handled various support tasks behind the front lines. Another wild goose chase, muttered Corporal Daniel Wilson, a former factory worker from Detroit. The Germans probably cleared everything out weeks ago. The two men approached a weathered 3-story building that appeared to have once been a grain storehouse. Its massive wooden doors hung slightly ajar, creaking in the spring breeze. Thomas pushed one open, the ancient hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dark, dust particles dancing in the few beams of light that managed to penetrate through small, high windows. The main floor appeared empty, except for scattered straw and broken crates, evidence of hasty evacuation. Nothing here, Wilson said, already turning to leave. Let's mark it clear and move on. But Thomas had noticed something unusual. Fresh footprints in the dust leading toward a narrow staircase in the far corner. Hold on, he said quietly. Someone's been here recently. Wilson frowned but followed as Thomas cautiously approached the stairs, his hand resting on his sidearm. The wooden steps creaked under their weight as they ascended to the second floor. The upper level was divided into what appeared to be former office spaces. As they moved through an empty doorframe, a sudden sound, the unmistakable intake of breath, stopped them in their tracks. Thomas raised his hand, signaling Wilson to hold position, then called out in the few German phrases he had learned, "Wir werden Ihnen nicht wehtun. Kommen Sie bitte heraus. We will not hurt you. Please come out." For several moments, silence was the only response. Then, from behind a large wooden cabinet, 2 young women slowly emerged, and Thomas found himself momentarily speechless. The sisters stood well over 6 feet tall, towering even over Thomas, who at 6 feet was considered tall for his generation. They appeared to be in their early 20s, with identical long blonde braids and features that mirrored each other. Though visibly terrified, they carried themselves with a natural dignity that their tattered clothes and gaunt faces could not diminish. "Amerikanische Soldaten," one of them whispered to the other, her eyes wide with apprehension. The slightly taller sister stepped protectively in front of her twin. "Bitte," she said in accented English, We have done nothing wrong. We are just trying to survive." Wilson stared openly, muttering under his breath, "Would you look at that? Giant German girls hiding in the attic." Thomas shot him a disapproving look before addressing the women directly. "We're not here to harm civilians. I'm Private Harrington, and this is Corporal Wilson. Are you alone here?" The taller sister, who introduced herself as Matilda, nodded cautiously. "Yes, I am Matilda Weber. This is my sister Greta. Our mother passed 2 winters ago. Our father was taken away last year to work in a factory farther east. We have been alone since then." As Thomas observed the sisters more carefully, he noticed the signs of severe malnutrition, their cheekbones sharply defined, wrists painfully thin despite their tall frames. A small pile of possessions lay in the corner, a few threadbare blankets, an empty water bucket, and what appeared to be a single potato. "When did you last eat?" Thomas asked, already reaching into his pack. The sisters exchanged glances. 3 days ago," Greta answered. "We found some old turnips in an abandoned field." Without hesitation, Thomas pulled out his rations, a tin of meat, some crackers, and a chocolate bar he'd been saving. "Here, take this," he said, extending his hand. Wilson grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" "Those are your rations for the next 2 days." "They need it more than I do," Thomas replied firmly, freeing his arm from Wilson's grasp. Matilda stared at the offered food with a mix of longing and suspicion. "Why would you help us? We are Germans." Thomas shook his head. "You're people who are hungry. That's all that matters right now." After a moment's hesitation, Matilda accepted the food with trembling hands. "Danke," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." Thomas nodded, then turned to Wilson. "We should report back to the lieutenant." "And tell him what? That you gave your rations to the enemy?" Wilson scoffed. "They're civilian women, not soldiers," Thomas countered. "And yes, we'll report finding them. The unit has protocols for civilian encounters." As they prepared to leave, Greta suddenly stepped forward. "Wait," she said, reaching into a small cloth pouch tied at her waist. She withdrew something and pressed it into Thomas's hand, a small carved wooden bird, its details worn smooth from handling. "It is not much, but it was our grandfather's. He was a woodcarver before." Thomas tried to refuse, but the sincerity in Greta's eyes stopped him. He carefully tucked the bird into his breast pocket. "I'll keep it safe," he promised. Back at the temporary command post, Lieutenant Woodward was predictably displeased with Thomas's actions. "You gave away your rations without authorization, Private, to German civilians." "They were starving, sir," Thomas replied, standing at attention. "Basic humanitarian aid is within protocols." Woodward's jaw tightened. "We barely have enough supplies for our own men. Your bleeding heart doesn't change military reality." "Harrington!" Before Thomas could respond, Captain Reynolds, the company commander, entered the room. Unlike Woodward, Reynolds was a former history teacher who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, a thoughtful leader who understood that winning the peace would require more than just military victory. "Problem, Lieutenant?" Reynolds asked, raising an eyebrow. Woodward explained the situation, his tone making clear his disapproval of Thomas's actions. To Thomas's surprise, Captain Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. Actually, Private Harrington's instincts were correct. Humanitarian gestures toward the civilian population are essential to our long-term mission. The German propaganda machine has told these people we're monsters. Every act of kindness undermines that narrative. Reynolds turned to Thomas. "These sisters, they're alone? No other family?" "They mentioned a father who was conscripted to work in a factory eastward, sir," Thomas replied. "No other family that they mentioned." Reynolds nodded. "We'll send someone from Civil Affairs to check on them tomorrow. For now, Harrington, take these extra rations to replace what you gave away." He handed Thomas several packages. "And take some additional supplies for the civilians. Consider it an investment in post-war relations." Thomas spent that evening repairing a damaged Jeep, his thoughts repeatedly returning to the Weber sisters. He wondered how 2 young women had survived alone through the final desperate months of the conflict, when even German soldiers were struggling to find food. Their resilience impressed him. It reminded him of his own family's struggle through the Depression years. The following morning, Thomas volunteered to accompany the civil affairs officer to check on the sisters. Captain Reynolds approved the request, noting that a familiar face might help ease tensions. However, when they arrived at the storehouse, they found not just Matilda and Greta, but also a tall, distinguished-looking older man with the same striking features as the sisters. He stood protectively before them, his bearing military despite his civilian clothes. "This is our father, Colonel Heinrich Weber," Matilda explained, her expression a mixture of joy and apprehension. "He returned last night." Colonel Weber studied Thomas intently before extending his hand in a formal gesture. "My daughters have told me what you did for them, Private Harrington. I understand I owe you a debt of gratitude." Thomas shook the offered hand, noting the calluses that seemed inconsistent with an officer's position. "No debt, sir. I just did what anyone should do." Weber's expression suggested this was not the response he had expected from an American soldier. Perhaps, but in these times, what should be done and what is done are often very different matters. Thomas learned that Colonel Weber had not been conscripted to a factory as his daughters believed. He had been a logistics officer in the German army, responsible for coordinating supply movements across the Western Front. When it became clear the conflict was lost, he had deserted his post to find his daughters, the only family he had left. "I knew if I waited for the official surrender, chaos would make it impossible to reach them," Weber explained as they sat at a small table in what had once been the storehouse office. "So I exchanged my uniform for civilian clothes and traveled by night." The civil affairs officer, Lieutenant Parker, was immediately alert. "You're admitting to being a German officer? You realize that makes you a prisoner of war?" Weber nodded calmly. "I am aware, but I had to ensure my daughter's safety first. Now that I have found them alive, thanks in part to your Private Harrington, I am prepared to accept whatever comes next." Thomas was struck by Weber's dignity and his obvious devotion to his daughters. Despite being on opposite sides of the conflict, Thomas recognized in Weber the same fundamental values that had driven his own father, family above all else. Lieutenant Parker stepped outside to radio headquarters for instructions regarding Weber's status. Meanwhile, Thomas noticed Greta quietly sorting through their meager possessions, setting aside a small notebook. "It contains our mother's recipes," she explained, seeing Thomas's interest. "We hope to keep it safe no matter what happened. My mother had something similar," Thomas found himself saying. "She passed when I was 14, but my sisters still make her apple pie using her recipe." This simple exchange, the universal value of family memories preserved through recipes, created an unexpected bridge between them. For a brief moment, they were not American and German, victor and vanquished, but simply people connected by common human experiences. Colonel Weber observed this interaction with interest. "You mentioned sisters, Private Harrington." "5 siblings, sir. I'm the oldest. My father runs a small repair shop in Pennsylvania." Weber nodded thoughtfully. "And yet you are here, thousands of miles from home, fighting in a foreign land." "Not by choice," Thomas admitted. "I was drafted." "As were many of our young men," Weber replied quietly. "The machinery of war cares little for individual desires." When Lieutenant Parker returned, his news surprised everyone. Headquarters has a particular interest in Colonel Weber. Apparently, his expertise in logistics makes him potentially valuable. They're sending a senior intelligence officer tomorrow to conduct a formal interview. That evening, Thomas found himself assigned to guard duty at the storehouse where the Webers were temporarily housed. The arrangement was not a formal detention, more a recognition of Weber's status as a high-ranking officer who had voluntarily surrendered. As night fell, Thomas stood outside, stamping his feet occasionally against the spring chill. The door opened, and Colonel Weber emerged, carrying 2 steaming cups. "Coffee is perhaps too generous a term for this brew," Weber said, offering one to Thomas, "but it is hot at least." Thomas accepted with thanks, surprised by the gesture. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as stars appeared in the clearing sky. "My daughters tell me you gave them your own rations," Weber finally said. "That you went hungry yourself as a result." Thomas shrugged. "Going hungry for a day or two isn't new to me. My family lost almost everything in the Depression. There were times we all skipped meals so the youngest could eat." Weber studied him with renewed interest. "So you understand true hunger, Not many Americans do, I think. More than you might imagine, Thomas replied. But fewer than should. This candid assessment seemed to impress Weber, who nodded slowly. You are an unusual soldier, Private Harrington. Just a mechanic who got drafted, Thomas corrected him. I fix things. Engines, mostly. That's what I did before, and what I'll do after if I make it home. A practical skill, Weber observed, one that builds rather than destroys. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Lieutenant Woodward, making his rounds. Seeing Thomas engaged in seemingly friendly conversation with Weber, Woodward's expression darkened. Fraternizing with the enemy, Harrington? He asked sharply. Before Thomas could respond, Weber spoke. The private was merely answering my questions about American reconstruction policies, Lieutenant. I was curious about what becomes of Germany after hostilities officially end. Woodward seemed unsatisfied, but continued on his rounds after reminding Thomas of proper protocol. Once he was out of earshot, Weber smiled slightly. Your lieutenant does not appear to share your humanitarian instincts. Lieutenant Woodward believes in following rules to the letter, Thomas replied diplomatically. And you? Thomas considered his answer carefully. I believe rules exist to serve principles. When they don't, the principles matter more. Weber nodded slowly. A dangerous philosophy for a soldier. Maybe, but necessary for a human being. The next morning, a jeep arrived carrying Major Richard Bennett from Intelligence Division. Unlike the stern, by-the-book officers Thomas was accustomed to, Bennett was relaxed and spoke fluent German. He spent several hours in private conversation with Colonel Weber, while Thomas was assigned to keep Matilda and Greta company, an assignment he suspected Captain Reynolds had arranged deliberately. The sisters were initially reserved, but gradually opened up as Thomas shared stories about his own family. He learned that before the war, they had lived on a small farm outside Bernheim. Their mother had taught music at the local school, while their father had managed agricultural distribution for the region, civilian work that his military logistics experience had built upon when he was commissioned in 1939. We were not political, Matilda explained carefully. Father never joined the party. It caused difficulties for him professionally. Greta nodded. Mother would not allow their symbols in our home. She said music and art belonged to humanity, not to governments. Thomas recognized the implied meaning in their careful phrasing, that their family had not supported the ideology of the German regime. Whether this was truly the case, or a narrative crafted for American ears, he couldn't be certain, but their evident relief at the conflict's end seemed genuine. By mid-afternoon, Major Bennett emerged from his interview with Colonel Weber, looking thoughtful. He conferred briefly with Captain Reynolds before approaching Thomas. Harrington, isn't it? The mechanic? Bennett asked. Yes, sir, Thomas replied, coming to attention. At ease, I understand you're the one who found the Weber sisters. Yes, sir. Corporal Wilson and I discovered them during a building search. Bennett nodded. Colonel Weber speaks highly of your conduct. Says you showed exceptional humanity in a situation where many wouldn't have. Thomas shifted uncomfortably under the praise. Just did what seemed right, sir. Bennett studied him for a moment. You know, we're facing an enormous challenge in the months ahead. Germany's infrastructure has been devastated. Transportation networks, power generation, water systems, all crippled. Millions of displaced people need to be fed and housed. It's a logistical nightmare. Yes, sir, Thomas replied, uncertain where this was heading. Colonel Weber was responsible for maintaining supply lines across the Western Front during the most challenging periods of the conflict. Despite chronic shortages and constant Allied bombing, he kept German forces functioning far longer than should have been possible. That kind of logistical genius could be invaluable, but on our side this time. Thomas's eyebrows rose in surprise. Sir? Bennett lowered his voice. Between us, Harrington, the real conflict that matters now is brewing with the Soviets. They're racing to capture German expertise, scientists, engineers, military minds. We're doing the same. Operation Paperclip is already recruiting German scientists. We need logistical experts too. Before Thomas could respond, they were interrupted by Captain Reynolds calling for Bennett. The Major nodded to Thomas and moved away. leaving him to process this unexpected information. That evening, Thomas was again assigned guard duty at the storehouse. As darkness fell, Colonel Webber joined him outside once more, this time without the pretense of coffee. "Major Bennett has made me an unusual proposal," Webber said without preamble. "I believe he may have mentioned something to you as well." Thomas nodded cautiously. "He suggested your expertise might be valuable." Webber gazed up at the night sky. "The Americans wish to employ me as a logistics consultant, initially here in occupied Germany, potentially later in America itself." He paused. "They are offering papers for me and my daughters. A new beginning. That sounds like a good opportunity," Thomas offered, watching Webber's expression closely. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is simply exchanging one master for another." Webber turned to face Thomas directly. "What would you do, Private Harrington, if you were in my position?" The question caught Thomas off guard. I don't know that I'm qualified to advise you, sir." "You are precisely qualified," Webber countered. "You are a young man who has seen both sides of this conflict. You have shown kindness to your supposed enemies. Your perspective interests me." Thomas considered carefully before responding. "My father always said that when facing an impossible choice, ask yourself which option lets you look your children in the eye years later." He glanced toward the storehouse where Matilda and Greta were preparing for bed. "Your daughters are alive. They have a future. Maybe that's what matters most now." Webber was quiet for a long moment. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "Just practical," Thomas replied, "like most people who've weathered hard times." The following morning, Colonel Webber requested a private meeting with Major Bennett and Captain Reynolds. Thomas was busy repairing a damaged radio when Greta sought him out. "Father has made his decision," she said, her expression a mixture of anxiety and hope. "We are going with your Americans." "That's good news," Thomas replied, setting aside his tools. "You'll be safe. That's what's important." Greta studied him with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "Father says it was something you said that helped him decide, about looking children in the eye." Thomas felt his face warm. "Just repeating my father's wisdom." "Your father raised a good man, Thomas Harrington," she said simply. Later that afternoon, Captain Reynolds summoned Thomas to the command tent. Inside, he found not only Reynolds and Major Bennett, but also Colonel Weber and Lieutenant Woodward. "Harrington," Reynolds began, "Colonel Weber has agreed to assist the Allied Reconstruction Authority as a logistics consultant. His first task will be helping reorganize transportation systems in this sector to expedite food distribution to civilian populations." Thomas nodded, uncertain why he was being informed of this decision in such a formal setting. "The Colonel has made one specific request as part of his agreement," Reynolds continued. "He's asked that you be assigned as his liaison officer." "Me, sir?" Thomas asked in surprise. "I'm just a mechanic and a private." Major Bennett smiled. "Not anymore. Congratulations on your field promotion to sergeant. Harrington, the paperwork is already being processed." Lieutenant Woodward's expression was unreadable, though the tight line of his mouth suggested displeasure at this unexpected development. "Colonel Webber believes your mechanical knowledge will be valuable in assessing damaged infrastructure," Reynolds explained. "And more importantly, he trusts you, a commodity in short supply right now." Webber stepped forward. "You showed kindness to my daughters when you had no reason to do so. You gave them food from your own rations when they were strangers to you, enemies by the definition of war. Such character is rare in any circumstances, but especially in conflict." He extended his hand. "I would be honored to work with you, Sergeant Harrington." Thomas accepted the handshake, still processing this sudden change in his circumstances. "I'll do my best, sir." "That," Webber said with the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from him, "is precisely why I requested you." In the days that followed, Thomas found himself in an unexpected role. No longer just a mechanic in a Marine unit, he worked alongside Colonel Webber, surveying damaged roads, bridges, and rail lines throughout the region. Webber's expertise in logistical systems was indeed remarkable. He could look at a map and immediately identify the most efficient routing to deliver supplies to the most people with the fewest resources. Thomas contributed his practical knowledge of vehicles and machinery, helping determine which damaged equipment could be repaired quickly and which would require replacement. Together, they formed an unlikely but effective partnership. Matilda and Greta also found purpose in this new arrangement. With their perfect bilingualism and knowledge of the region, they became valuable interpreters, helping facilitate communication between American reconstruction teams and local German officials. One evening, about 2 weeks after Weber's decision, Thomas joined the family for a simple dinner in the small cottage they had been assigned. The meal was basic, American rations supplemented with fresh vegetables from a garden Greta had started, but the atmosphere was surprisingly comfortable. "I received confirmation today," Weber announced as they ate. "Our paperwork has been approved for eventual relocation to America, after our work here is completed, of course." Thomas looked up in surprise. "That's wonderful news," he said sincerely. "Where will you be settling?" "Pennsylvania, initially," Weber replied, watching Thomas's reaction closely. "Near Pittsburgh. There is a university there interested in developing new logistics curriculum based on wartime experiences." "Pennsylvania?" Thomas repeated, setting down his fork. "That's my home state." Matilda smiled. "We know. Father specifically requested that region." Thomas glanced between the three of them, suddenly understanding. "You chose Pennsylvania because of me?" Weber nodded. "It seemed appropriate. A new beginning in the home of the person who made it possible." He paused. "And perhaps when you return home after your service, you might consider a position in our program. Your practical experience would complement the theoretical frameworks." The offer caught Thomas completely off guard. Before the war, the idea of university education had been financially impossible for someone of his background. Now, this former enemy was offering him a path to a future he had never imagined possible. I don't know what to say," Thomas managed finally. "Say you will consider it," Greta suggested quietly. "That would be enough for now." As spring turned to summer, the unlikely partnership between Thomas and the Weber family continued to flourish. The rebuilding efforts they coordinated helped restore basic services to dozens of communities across the region. Where suspicion and resentment might have prevailed, seeds of cooperation and reconciliation were planted instead. Thomas found himself changed by the experience. The rigid divisions between us and them that military training had instilled began to dissolve as he worked alongside German civilians who, like Americans, simply wanted to rebuild their lives after years of hardship. Colonel Weber changed as well. The formal, reserved officer gradually revealed a dry sense of humor and a passionate interest in architecture that had been his private hobby before the war. He spoke of rebuilding Germany not just physically, but culturally, restoring the humanitarian traditions that had been suppressed. By August 1945, as news of events in the Pacific reached them, Thomas received orders for redeployment. The evening before his departure, the Webers hosted a small gathering for him. "You came to our country as part of an invading force," Colonel Weber said, raising a glass in toast. "You leave as family. History works in strange ways." "To new beginnings," Thomas responded, raising his own glass, "and unexpected friendships." Later, as Thomas prepared to leave, Greta approached him privately. She handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "To replace what you gave away," she explained. Inside, Thomas found an elegant leather-bound notebook. "For your mechanical designs," Greta said. "You mentioned wanting to create better agricultural equipment for small farms when you return home." "Thank you," Thomas said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I'll write to you all, once I'm settled back home." Greta hesitated, then reached up to adjust the collar of his uniform with a familiarity that suggested more than casual friendship. "We will be counting on it, Sergeant Harrington." 18 months later, in December 1946, Thomas Harrington stood on the platform at Pittsburgh's Union Station, watching as passengers disembarked from the New York train. The war had been over for more than a year, and Thomas had returned to civilian life, working at his father's repair shop while taking evening engineering classes at a local technical college funded by the GI Bill. When he spotted the three tall figures moving through the crowd, his face broke into a broad smile. Colonel Weber, Now Professor Weber, led the way, followed by Matilda and Greta, all three bundled against the Pennsylvania winter. "Welcome to Pittsburgh," Thomas called, waving to catch their attention. As they approached, Thomas was struck by how much healthier they looked compared to when he had first met them. No longer the gaunt refugees of wartime Germany, but vibrant individuals ready to begin new lives. "Sergeant Harrington," Weber greeted him warmly, clasping his hand. "Or should I say, Student Harrington now?" "Just Thomas will do," he replied with a grin. Matilda embraced him with European formality, but Greta's hug lingered a moment longer than strictly necessary. "We have brought German winter recipes," she told him, "to thank your family for helping us settle." As Thomas loaded their luggage into his father's truck, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A chance encounter in an abandoned storehouse, a simple act of sharing food with hungry strangers, a carved wooden bird given in gratitude, and now former enemies building new lives together in peacetime. "My father is eager to meet you all," Thomas told them as they drove through the snowy Pennsylvania countryside. "He says any man who raised daughters like yours must have something worth learning." Weber smiled, looking more relaxed than Thomas had ever seen him. "And I am eager to meet the father of the young man who taught an old soldier that humanity transcends borders and uniforms." As they approached the Harrington family farm, Thomas thought about the small carved bird that still sat on his dresser, a reminder that even in the darkest times, simple acts of kindness could blossom into something profound and lasting. The story of Thomas Harrington and the Weber family would become part of local legend in their Pennsylvania community, how a poor American soldier and two German sisters created an unexpected bridge between former enemies, proving that even after the most devastating of conflicts, reconciliation and new beginnings were possible for those with the courage to see the humanity in their supposed enemies. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.